what is fair for research data. I am a research assistant professor at the University of Notre Dame in the Department of Computer Science and Engineering, and I'm also a computational scientist in our Center for Research Computing. And so the subtitle of this is going to be an introduction to fair data, but I also want to touch on why I think it's so hard to be fair. And what sorts of things that we have to do in order to make it less difficult, okay? And so what do we mean by fair data? Okay, well, what we mean is general properties of scientific data and what we call fair data principles. And this means that things are findable, they're accessible, they're interoperable, and they're reusable. Okay, and the idea behind this came out of a research paper in Nature Scientific Data in 2016 called The Fair Guiding Principles for Scientific Data Management and Stewardship. And this was by Mark Wilkinson, who is a long background in biomedical ontologies and in the biomedical community. But there was a large, sort of group of people that contributed and signed on to this, and it gained some traction. And so the G20, the EU, various US funding agencies have decided that these principles are useful and that they should be encouraged for scientific data. Okay, and so in the interim, there's been a community that has developed around this, the Go Fair community. And they have published additional papers. They are building community in terms of domain communities and what fair means to those particular communities. I'll go into that in a little bit. But their main sort of focus is a general set of principles that correspond to best practices for each of those sort of elements of FAIR. And so the first one with findable, it basically talks about identifiers and how we identify both data and metadata using persistent and globally unique identifiers, and then providing metadata that is returned along with those identifiers when you dereference them, right? And that they're searchable, right? And so some of this is, how do we integrate with, Bing and Google and all these other search engines in order to discover information, right? The accessible bit is essentially talking about the web. And so how do we dereference information using web principles, right? Hopefully using HTTP, HTTPS, but other protocols using the web are also possible, right? They don't really, specify those things. And also, what happens when the data is no longer available? And so how is metadata aggregated to other sort of repositories in order for at least some information about that data set to still be accessible, right? Potentially, who the principal investigators are, the subject matters, where if information was derived from other information. The interoperable sort of part of FAIR is talking about how we do representation of knowledge, right? And so to make things interoperable and integrated, we have to have context. We actually have to have what I would call deep context. And so metadata in a formal knowledge representation system and a formal vocabulary gives machines and humans the ability to understand what the information is or what the data object is, and how to use those. And vocabularies in and of themselves are data, right? And so those also have to follow FAIR principles. I'll talk about that a little bit toward the end of my talk, right? And probably the most important from my perspective is what I will call linked data. It's not called that in the actual principle, but the idea is that metadata and data include qualified references to other data and metadata. And so this also gives context to the information, right? And I'll give some examples of what I mean by that a little bit later in my talk. And then the last one, reusability. This is not reproducibility. So in talking with various groups over time, as I have been as part of being part of the Center of Excellence pilot, this does seem to get a little bit confused, and we're not necessarily talking about reproducibility, although reproducibility is a slight aspect of this, right? But this is more capturing the provenance information, right? And making sure that the data have a clear license so that somebody, if they can access the data, are actually free to reuse it, or at least know what limitations that they can reuse the data with. And also, lastly, this is the sort of bit that then ties into community standards. So each scientific domain sort of developing their own relevant community standards. Okay, so I mentioned community earlier, right? And so the FAIR community is building out these implementation networks, and these are sort of domain specific, and they're sort of three different pillars in terms of go build, go change, and go train, which correspond to the technology, sort of a cultural change in the sciences, and also training, because these things need dissemination of sort of higher level, how do we do this sort of information, right? Okay, so one last comment from the quote that I like from the Wilkinson paper, right? And so the primary limitation of humans, however, is that we're unable to operate the scope, scale, and speed necessitated by the scale of contemporary scientific data and the complexity of e-science. It's for this reason that humans increasingly rely on computational agents to undertake discovery and integration tasks on their behalf, right? And so the idea of fair is it's not just fair for humans, but it also has to be fair for machines, because the idea behind this is that we will increasingly have to have agents to help us to do science, to help us discover information. And so we need to structure the information so that both humans and machines understand both the data and the metadata contexts, okay? What FAIR is not? So I think this is important. It's not a standard, okay? And so it's a set of guiding principles that can be implemented using many different standards, right? And so the community is free to figure out, what fair is for them and what standards need to be applied to make things fair. But fair in and of itself is not a standard. It's open to other things. It's also not equivalent to open, even though I think that there's should be some guiding principles toward making scientific data open. It's not equivalent to open. And in fact, there's many communities out there in industry, say in pharmaceutical industry, who are implementing fair principles for their own internal use because it's useful for their own scientists, right? And it's certainly not open. There's access controls, right? And it also means that the access controls and the accessibility conditions are also described by metadata, right? And so non-open data can be entirely fair, right? And lastly, they don't talk about the data quality or ethics, right? And so we're not saying anything that fair data is necessarily better data or any sort of metric along those lines. But what we are saying is that fair data should be useful, right, in determining whether or not it's good data or not, or the context behind how this data was captured, right? There's a process, right? I'm not going to go into a large amount of detail, but there's information on the GoFair.org page on how to start this out, how to basically go through a process of looking at the data, looking at vocabularies, doing this linking that I was talking about, assigning licenses, all these sorts of things, okay? Okay, so that's an introduction. So now where's the problem, right? So why is it so hard to be fair? I was attending the Earth Science Information Partners summer meeting about 3 weeks ago, and there's a large, vibrant community of Earth science informaticians and scientists. And in the one of the structured data on the web sessions, Ruth Durr put up a slide that caught my attention. And this is from a project in 2018 looking at the interoperability and, I would say, quote unquote fairness, although it wasn't really initially intended for that, polar data, right? And so there were a couple of observations that she made from sort of a study of this data, right? And one of the issues is that even though repositories and organizations may be using standardized metadata. The implementations of those things may differ amongst repositories, and that causes some degrees lack of interoperability, right? They spend a lot of time aggregating and harvesting information which has already been aggregated by other groups. So it's already in some repository. Another repository comes along and crawls the other repository and pulls in information. Unfortunately, when they do that, they also tend to reassign identifiers because they want to centralize in their own repository, which then sort of loses the link to the original repositories, right? And then the last one is there's a lot of different technologies in use, but no consistency in how those technologies are sort of applied through interfaces, right? And so these are just some issues that I think caught my attention. And so a couple of observations, right? And the first one is I think that there's a driving force toward centralization. And this driving force is essentially the idea that, and it's behind most applications these days. Think of Facebook or think of Google as trying to aggregate all of the particular information on a person. And so, these repositories and aggregators are viewing themselves as the first class citizen or the curator of all knowledge, and not really thinking of themselves in terms of an ecosystem and how to design that ecosystem. And so one way to think about this, though, is that their linked data in and of itself, Tim Berners-Lee sort of outlined this in, I believe, 2006, came up with some principles that are inherently decentralized. They have the opposite sort of view of essentially trying to centralize all resources and create one large clearinghouse. And so these essentially are, use web infrastructure to name things, URIs, right? Make them HTTP URIs so that if you ask for something, you get something in a response, right? Use some web standards like, knowledge graph information format. So RDF is a knowledge graph information format. Sparkle is a query language for that, right? And lastly, include links to other things so that they can discover other things. And so this is going to be a recurring theme in my talk about linking to other things, right? Okay, so this was 2006, right? Where has that really gone? And so there's been a sort of renewed thought about this in terms of particularly with respect to social data. But I think it's also broadly applicable to scientific data. And so Ruben Verbo has a very nice blog post on sort of the places where I think linked data and maybe the semantic web community sort of didn't live up to its entire potential in terms of tooling, in terms of community, in terms of many different things, right? And so he basically goes through this, and this is also from 2018, of how we may want to start to address these things. But I'm linking this because I think that there's a nice diagram in there. And so this is what I mean by centralized versus decentralized. And so in the left-hand diagram, you can see that current, sort of application architectures assume that you have sort of one backend and an application that talks to that backend, or one backend that maybe talks to maybe several backends that are containerized using, some core mechanism for security or other sorts of mechanisms like that, but they're relatively constrained, right? But the decentralized approach basically says this, that if we separate the data from the applications, then we can create these data pods, right? And these data pods are sort of decentralized, and that one app can basically talk to many different resources, discover many different resources, and applications can, then sort of be decoupled from this strong coupling to the back end, this strong coupling to centralization, right? I will say that there's been some progress, right? And so Tim Berners-Lee about a year and a half ago or 2 years ago formed a company called Inrupt. They have just released a enterprise version of what they think that the web software and these pods should look like. It's called Solid. This web page has some very nice overviews of how that sets of technology work in a decentralized world. So I think that's the first thing, is centralization versus decentralization. And I'll make a comment that I think that scientific applications are also going toward implementing some of these decentralized sort of features, right? And so this is a sort of a tweet thanking some groups, Paco Nathan in particular, that did implementations of linked data inside of the Jupyter ecosystem. So Jupyter Labs, Metadata Explorer, and Data Catalog Explorer all are based on these linked data principles. And so this means that you can connect, you know, your sort of scientific analysis engine to many different data sources and do analysis and aggregation using that sort of decentralized app approach. He gives so Paco Nathan gave a really nice talk at ESEP, a winter session, which goes into detail about this and how to apply AI to these sorts of things and why AI needs deep context. And I will direct you to those slides, that it is well worth looking at. Okay, the other thing is that another application that has done this briefly is R, so the ecological metadata as linked data. So there's other communities and other software that are also thinking along these lines. Okay, so that's part one. And I think we'll pause here for a second to see if there are any questions. I don't see any questions in the chat, but see if there's any outstanding questions on that first little bit.
Yeah, check. I don't think there are any questions at this
Okay.
point in time. And if anything pops up that's urgent, I'll let you know.
Okay, all right. Then I think we'll carry on. Okay, so problem number 2 is persistent identifiers. And persistent identifiers are hard. And part of it is the sort of applying a web resource, so a URI or URL, right? And the context behind those to a object, right? So mapping between some real world thing and something that is a sort of a web technology thing, right? And so there's, once again, you know, the idea of linked data as a possible solution behind this, right? Because it gives us some guidelines for using URIs to name things, use dereferenceable URIs so that you can go get information about those things. But they also have, URI resources also have semantics themselves. And so the issue is, how do you disambiguate something that's an identifier for something, or something that's an information resource about the identifier for something, right? And create those links, right? And so that's one of the first problems. And that's also one of the reasons why in that original diagram that I put up with the problem, right, that URIs end up being reminted, or persistent identifiers end up getting reminted, and they also then, the provenance chain of where those things came from also ends up getting lost, right? And it's because we've sort of lost this connection between the identifier of an abstract thing and the identifier of a resource which provides me information about that. Now, there's a couple of good papers out there, which I don't have time, unfortunately, to go into. But this first one is from the biology community. It's Identifiers for the 21st Century. And they give some guidelines, which I think are quite useful, particularly in terms of maintaining provenance, using clearinghouses for essentially disambiguating identifiers, using prefixes, so something called a query, and providing also metadata, right? And this paper does a very nice job of talking about that. And one of the clearinghouses that I'll mention that they talk about in the paper, which is growing, is Identifiers.org. This is primarily aimed at biological data, but it also has clearinghouses for things like ORCIDs, which are research identifiers, and also for license identifiers and other sorts of things. So it's growing beyond the community that is biological databases. And they're at least a good reference to look at as for how to do this. Another resource I'll put up just very briefly and talks about this issue of how to do identifiers, how to do linking between cross identifiers. And this is with respect to the SARS CoV-2 virus that we're all sort of trying to deal with. And I think this is a very interesting blog post because it gives you context behind this idea of information in different databases, so this decentralized world, but applications needing to use information from these multiple different databases and having the context to be able to understand what those are in order to do science. And so I think this blog post very much lays it out. And he also lays out how a resource like Wikidata, which is run by the Wikimedia Foundation, same people that do, Wikimedia, Wikipedia, the identifiers there provide crosswalks. And so I think it's well worth having a look at. The other thing I'll say is I'll talk briefly at the end about best practices for vocabularies. And so another way of doing permanent identifiers is a W3C group, which is interested in providing those permanent identifiers, things that don't necessarily rot over time like a domain ID or domain registration. And so this sort of creates a permanent identifier separate from that and allows you to link it to things that are in GitHub. And it basically is run through GitHub. So they have a GitHub repository, you fork it, you create a namespace in the W3ID namespace and some access rules for Apache. And it then creates a namespace for your vocabulary or your ontology, which is persistent and linked back to GitHub. So that way you don't have to worry about running web services. As long as GitHub is around, then you're likely to be able to get to the information. And as long as the W3C is around. Okay, third problem is machine readable interfaces, right? So part of the issue with the implementations of the standard in that diagram that I showed was that the fact that everyone is implementing their own metadata standards, but they're not implementing the interfaces in a standardized way, or at least in a machine readable way that makes it explicit to the machine what is going on, okay? And so the issue, once again, is that the interface for the digital object is not the object itself, right? And this is sort of a related issue to the persistent identifiers, right? And I think that there's a really nice engineering report, which is currently being developed from the Open Geospatial Consortium, OGC. And this is using essentially standardized APIs and landing pages for link data for hydrology and for environmental features. And this was run by the USGS and a few other organizations. And basically, it's a bunch of engineers who wanted to start kicking the wheels outside of an academic lab on how do we actually build a linked data ecosystem. And so they have a really nice diagram in there, which I sort of think sort of identifies what I was talking about and have been sort of harping on in previous slides. And this idea is that we have things in the world that are non-information resources, right? So you want to represent, say, a person named Chuck, but you can't really send Chuck through a web pipeline and deliver him to through a web browser, right? And so you have something that is an identifier, a persistent identifier that represents me, right? But that's different than the landing pages, right? And so the W3C a while ago recommended that what you do is you create a persistent identifier for the human feature, right? The human thing. And then do a 303, which is a C also reader, I think it's C also, a 303 redirect, right? C other, which then gets you from a non-information resource to a landing page content on an information resource. And that information resource can then provide information in different structured format, right? So it can provide it as GeoJSON or as JSON or as XML or a whole bunch of different realizations. But that landing page is sort of the central thing because it gives you a human readable resource about the thing, right? Data content, right? Which is sort of this bottom part. But it also gives you a machine readable through content negotiation, dereferenceable information, right? And so that way machines can say, how can you hand this to me in a way that I understand and can make use of, okay? This report, as I said, is fairly good. It's written at a fairly broad level. And so I think that looking at that is a valuable resource. The other thing that I think is sort of coming down the road, and this was alluded to in the OGC selfie report, was content negotiation by profile. And so what this does is it expands what we call content negotiation, which is basically a way of a web client asking for a particular resource representation from a server, right? So can you hand this to me as HTML? Can you hand this to me as JSON? Can you hand this information to me in another format, right? A serialization, right? And so what content negotiation by profile does is it creates a landing page like this, right? So this is some resource in Australia for some address, right? But if you append a query string to it and say alternates, it basically you get back a alternate view of that landing page, which basically gives a smart client the ability to then negotiate in terms of not just the type of serialization that it wants, right? Whether it's XML or HDF5 or whatever, right? But it also lets you select which vocabularies you want to use. And so now an application can say, I know schema.org. I know that very well. I know that URI. Why don't you hand it back to me in that vocabulary? Or it can ask for something more quote unquote useful if it needs broader semantics, right? Okay. So yeah, last sort of slide based also on this Australian project is I think that we're also moving toward hybrid approaches in terms of APIs providing interfaces to sort of these RDF based knowledge graphs, right? And that these things are coupled, that essentially some resources and the metadata are stored inside of the knowledge graph, inside of the accessible through the Sparkle endpoint, possibly. But you provide convenience APIs for the data. And the way that the Australians are using this is that the underlying spatial information, so things that are in a spatial vector format, so a shape file or something like that, those are fairly large. You do not want to store those in a knowledge graph, but you want to provide a URI that when you dereference that, you get back that data object. All the information about that URI is then stored inside of a knowledge graph, which is accessible through a Sparkle interface. And so now you can start to combine the knowledge information in a knowledge graph where you can operate on it in an appropriate way in the metadata, ask questions of it, but then also be able to accommodate large data stores, things that don't belong in a knowledge graph and from a cyber infrastructure perspective affect performance significantly. Okay. Okay, so the last problem is which vocabularies, right? And so under the interoperable flag, it basically talks about structuring your data and metadata using vocabularies. And it talks about how do we do this, right? And it leaves that sort of as an open question. It just says that we should. And so this last part of my talk here, I think, is probably going to be the most sort of abstract. And I think this is also the hardest problem, which carries over baggage from sort of the semantic web and from the linked data world. But I think there's also some direction there that we can start to point, which I think are starting to be engineered into real world systems, which are quite useful. Okay, so in and of themselves, vocabularies are data and they have metadata about them themselves, right? And they can be embedded inside of the knowledge graph, or they can be, embedded in separate metadata objects that link to it, as I had mentioned in the last slide with these APIs, right? But they have to be treated as first-class citizens, right? And so they have to be fair themselves, right? They have to be linked. So interlinking of vocabulary terms, I think, is pretty important, and I'll give a demonstration of that toward the end here. And I think we need to start thinking about how do we start to harmonize these things, that these things don't live independently. And this is this sort of linked recommendation in the interoperability thing, where you need to link to other terms and other vocabularies to give broader contexts. Okay. So a really good paper that I think has now been accepted, but the preprint is available on Archive, talks about best practices for implementing fair vocabularies and ontologies. And these are sort of procedural and mechanical sorts of things about how do we embed data and metadata in a vocabulary file in the best way? How do we identify the provenance information about who created those? How do we create human readable documentation, as I said earlier, that we want landing pages for these resources that provide human readable and machine readable information, right? So how do I do the documentation? This goes through all of those, and it also goes through how do we create persistent identifiers inside of ontologies and vocabularies and what those need to be. So given that, I will move on to another paper which I think is also really important, but probably not as accessible. And this one is sort of a historic look back over the last 10 years of vocabularies and ontologies on the web and how they've progressed, right? And sort of asking, we have a lot of fragmentation. We're not really doing the linked data thing, even though we should be. Maybe are we better off with one vocabulary? And I'm not going to answer that question because I think the paper goes through a very nice sort of overview of it. And I think my view of the paper is that the answer is maybe. And I'll get to why I think that that's true here in sort of the next slide. And so from this paper, they have this really nice diagram that I like. They sort of view this, I think, as a problem. I sort of view this as a feature. And so, but with some missing elements. And so the idea is that on the web of information, on the semantic web and the linked data web, right, we sort of have these different classes of ontologies or vocabularies, right? And so we have these upper ontologies, which are essentially philosophical artifacts, right? They are trying to capture an entire world of knowledge. What is knowledge? Those sorts of things. And so the example of that is basic formal ontology, which is sort of the foundation of most of the biological ontologies, right? Dolce is another example of this. And then you sort of have these mid-level ontologies, which I think are occasionally linked to the upper ontologies, but more often than not are standalone. And these come from sort of standards organizations. So most of these have come from the W3C. So PROV, SOSA, SSN, ORG, FOF are all products of the World Wide Web Consortium, the same standards organization that defines how your web browser works with HTML. Then under that, I think we have these domain ontologies. And so some of the examples of these are the gene ontology, GEO, or CHEBI, which is the chemical entities of biological interest ontology, right? And these are much more specified. These are much more specific to a particular sort of worldview. And I think underneath that, we have these use case ontologies. And these use case ontologies is what I would call an application ontology. And so this is where I think more of the linked data infrastructure comes into play in terms of connecting to these higher degrees of information, right? One side note, so a lot of my research interest in the last 8 years or so has been how do we create patterns, just like software design patterns make software programming easier. Can we create ontology design patterns that make implementing ontologies and vocabularies easier? And so Christoph Janowitz at the Web Ontology Pattern Workshop in 2015 gave a really nice set of slides. And I'm going to basically just sort of concentrate on this one right here, on how we can use these sort of atomic ontology patterns to essentially bridge the gap between these different levels of the pyramid, right? And so the idea is that you have repositories which have some local ontology and local view, but then you can use a global ontology pattern to then start to link those different views together. So remember back in the slide with the problem statement, right? That, one of the issues was that, there wasn't this interoperability between the different repositories, right? And so the question is, can we use patterns to give us essentially views on the data, which then tie back to what a domain scientist's view is? And I think that that's an interesting area of research, and some applications are starting to sort of be driven out of that approach, right? And there's an example using something called semantic trajectory, which I won't go into. If you're interested in this approach, there's a very nice accessible tutorial using recipes, cooking recipes, which I highly recommend going through. And it shows how we can use these sort of modular, reusable ontology patterns in order to build up a knowledge graph or a knowledge base about what cooking is and what a recipe is and all of those other sorts of modeling issues. Okay, so what are examples of these mid-level ontologies for FAIR? Well, I mentioned a couple of them. So the first one is, and I think probably one of the most important ones, is the provenance ontology from the W3C. And this basically captures the who, what, where, why sort of background of a data object and where it came from and how it was derived and who was behind it, right? And it's essentially an ontology design pattern in and of itself, based upon an agent, a activity, and an entity. And so I think that's one of the sort of core patterns that I think there's a lot of tooling for and is sort of a starting point, I think, for starting to build out FAIR data. There's some other ontologies which I think are useful for spatial information or for categorizing some of the provenance information behind a data set. So the time ontology in OWL, I think, is very important. GeoSparkle, which is actually being retooled to GeoSparkle 2.0. So GeoSparkle is essentially a ontology for spatial data, for spatial objects published by the Open Geospatial Consortium. There is the ontology, what I will call for observations. It's called the Semantic Sensor Network ontology, but it actually talks about observations. It talks about sampling. It talks about sensors. It talks about actuators. So it's being used by the Internet of Things, but I think it also is widely adopted and widely applicable and very well engineered, right? And so I think it's a good starting point mid-level ontology. And the last one, I think, which is really important for cyber infrastructure and large facilities, is the data catalog vocabulary, which was just released the second version, version 2, in February. And this basically tells you, an agent, what a data set is and how it's distributed and what its representation is and what the provenance behind that digital object actually is, right? And those are very, very well developed and provide you a basis then for talking about more, linking into more domain-specific vocabularies later on. Okay. The last part of that paper that I mentioned with the pyramid that I think is the Alex Polaris paper, is he also goes through and looks at an analysis of something called schema.org, Wikidata, and actually something called Debiapedia as a possibility of, is there one ontology that's taking over the web? And I think his conclusion is not quite, because I think they have different purposes, right? But I think they're also very useful for FAIR data and for the sciences, right? And so I think that Wikidata is, particularly in the biosciences, is getting some traction in terms of storing and providing a clearinghouse information for life science information, so for the biology community. And with the issues of COVID and some of these other rapid deployment of knowledge graphs, it has shown quite a bit of utility in the past couple months, and I think that utility is expanding, particularly in being able to provide a sort of public accessible and curated knowledge graph that people can contribute to and download information on. And it's also, they've developed an entire sort of provenance mechanism for quality of data behind the scenes. So this paper does a nice job of talking about it. Schema.org, which I think is another vocabulary which should be sort of foundational for cyber infrastructure in the sciences, insofar as that it is adopted by search engines for the findability aspect of FAIR. And so as part of ESEP, there's a science on schema.org or schema.org cluster there that is trying to figure out, what are guidelines for scientific repositories and for scientific experiments in terms of publishing their data. And so I was an author on this. All of the guidelines are in GitHub. They're in Markdown. So all of the sort of recommendations plus examples plus decision records as to why we think that it should be this way are in the repository. And so the landing pages that I mentioned earlier, those also need context behind them that is machine readable, embedded in the HTML. And so the idea is that you can embed some metadata in those landing pages that then Google can find and provide broader context to people who are searching for those data sets through Google or Google dataset search. And then the last sort of topic is harmonization and linking of domain ontologies. And this is probably the most abstract topic. But part of what I've been involved with as part of the Cyber Infrastructure Center of Excellence is these harmonization efforts. And there's two ontologies, the environmental ontology and the semantic web for environment and terminology suite. These are two different vocabularies at different degrees of formalization and different degrees of utilization, use in the world. But they have related concepts, right? And so, for example, in our hackathons and our work there in harmonization, we've been concentrating on the cryosphere. So this has been on the sort of that particular realm. And so, for example, a glacial process, right, as a vocabulary term. Well, in Suite, if you go to that URI, that dereferenceable identifier in Suite Ontology, you'll get this exact web page, right, which is a human readable web page. But if you ask for the machine for this in JSON LD or JSON or some other format, you also can get machine readable information. And here, there's not really a lot of information. It's just a subclass of something that's called a physical process. But it has this thing called SCOS close match, which points to this PURL OBO invo thingy, right? Another URI. So if you actually go dereference that, you end up at a landing page there for a glacial process, right? And it is, here it's defined as a close match. So an agent coming in knows that in Suite and Envo, these glacial process terms are almost exact, right? There may be some slight differences in terms of reasoning, but as far as being able to use the term interchangeably, you can, right? And you'll notice here that also there's a database cross-reference back to the Suite ontology, right? And so now agents landing here wanting a machine readable form and wanting to go and try to figure out what something means can follow their nose to the Suite ontology. You'll also notice here that its formalism is a little bit higher, right? And that it's not only a subclass of some environmental system process, which is even more specific than the physical process that Suite was, but it also says that it has to have some participant, right? It has a participant, and that's either a glacier or an ice sheet, right? And so now you know that there's a process that has things that participate in the process, and those things for this particular process has to be either a glacier or an ice sheet. So you've made it even more constrained so that machine has better understanding of what you actually mean by the term. There's also alignments back to these mid-level ontologies, right? And so Suite now provides alignments back, an alignment graph back to SOSA SSN. So if you're talking about a sensor or an observation in Suite, you can link that to an observation in Envo. They know that they're exactly the same thing or that they're related in some way, right? Lastly, these guys do, I think, what is quite nice in terms of GitHub-driven development. And so they promote open community in terms of people wanting to add terms. You can create a GitHub issue in either of the repositories and say, this is some information, these are where the terms labels are, this is where I think it should fit. And then during these harmonization efforts, we go through these issues and start to add back in terms that are suggested or missing or issues, right? So I think that that's another nice sort of feature of the community that's building up around this. Okay, last slide is just some thoughts on sort of the things that we've been doing in the Cyber Infrastructure Center of Excellence in terms of some of our engagements and some of the things I think that we've sort of taken away from that, right? And so I view large facilities in cyber infrastructure as sort of a crucial component to FAIR becoming more widely adopted, right? And I think that large facilities and cyber infrastructure needs to connect to these FAIR communities where also this other work is going on. Places like Research Data Alliance, ESIP, CODATA, GoFair, all of these sorts of organizations. I think that we need to start building those particular bridges, and I've been working, to try to do that. The second thing is that I think we're missing some of the engineering cyber infrastructure building blocks, but I think those are starting to appear in terms of the Python RDF lib, the RDF.js project, which is building JavaScript tools for handling all these sort of metadata objects. There's a company called Zazuko, which I'm very fond of, which are building open source tools, which are incredibly useful. And they have, are building these tools as part of projects with the Swiss government, but they're encouraged to basically build community behind them. And the Swiss government is publishing most of their data now, or intends to publish most of their data in terms of FAIR and linked data. And then, as I mentioned, this interrupt solid, I think that's another project to watch to see how that progresses. And then my last one is knowledge engineering. And I think this is the hardest part because I don't think that knowledge engineering is trivial or necessarily straightforward, especially to do it well. And I think that this is probably where we need specific communities which can go in and start to do this harmonization, start to do the verification of vocabularies, start to link these things together, and then start to build those bridges back to the research community so that they then have better ideas of what vocabularies to use. And if a vocabulary doesn't fit their needs, or they need something different, connecting them to a place where either those vocabularies can be built or helping them to build their own vocabularies. And then linking, most importantly, linking those vocabularies to other things, to other vocabularies, right? And so I think those are some of the top level things that I've sort of observed during this process. So with that, I'll thank you. There's a couple of links there back to the Cyber Infrastructure Center of Excellence pilot page, and then some of the clusters in ESIP that I think are in RDA, which I think are pretty useful. The schema.org cluster, the semantic harmonization cluster, and then IADOPT in RDA, which is working on observables. So what do we mean by a observable property in science, right? And what does that actually mean? So with that, I will take questions.
Thank you very much, Chuck, for that awesome presentation. At this moment, I don't see any questions in the chat function, but I've unmuted everyone. So if you have a question or a thought that you want to share, go ahead.
Good stuff, Chuck.
Thank you. Well, okay, so I will start, since people are not asking me questions, maybe I'll start asking some questions. This is usually what you do, students, right? So, I mean, a couple of the things that I've sort of been pondering is, particularly with the Cyber Infrastructure Center of Excellence pilot that we're currently sort of I guess wrapping up the tail ends of, but going forward, we sort of want to know what would be useful. What would be useful in terms of, I think, at different levels of the cyber infrastructure and cyber infrastructure practitioners. And some of those things, range from using things like software carpentry to build out, fair carpentry, which there's some organizations that are doing that, and maybe semantic carpentry and vocabulary carpentry, and maybe some set of, very short courses that at least give you the foundations. And then maybe something that's more targeted to developers and cyber infrastructure developers in terms of sort of the linked data tooling that's out there of how can I, reuse JSON and these sorts of web applications I'm currently building for, cyber infrastructure and for scientists, and start to integrate in some of the more semantic tools and some of the AI tools, essentially. So with that, I guess my question is that does that make sense? That sort of point of view, or are there other sorts of things that you struggle with that you think that we might help with, I guess, or that we could start to build community around? Or did everyone fall asleep?
I guess since anybody else is not asking questions, I'll ask one for you, Chuck. So you know that we're engaged with both Sage and Gage on a different project, on different engagement, right? And that's an example of two different, two related yet different repositories, and linked data is one way that the two different repositories could kind of do that harmonization step, right? But in terms of developing a common platform, right? How do they go about designing? Suppose there was nothing,
Yeah.
right? And you wanted to develop something from scratch. Uh, how do you design that? What are the high level tools that you would look into for that?
Yeah, exactly. So I think that luckily all of these linked data principles sort of follow web development principles, only I would say they're on steroids, right? And so a lot of these linked data toolkits use standard, sorts of web API development toolkits. And so, for example, right, the Open Geospatial Consortium, they have a bunch of map tools out there, which are web standards, and they're the spatial community standards that most of the Esri REST and all of these other services are sort of built on, right? But they started with something called Flask, which is a web development toolkit, right? And then they built in the semantics, being able to build out these landing pages, right? So that when you go to a data set, you end up on a landing page that gives you information about that resource. And importantly, web crawlers can also end up on those landing pages and figure out that there's a machine readable version of that web resource that from the embedded metadata in that human readable page, right? And these are all pretty standard tools in that what I just talked about with the embedding information in the human landable pages. Well, there's thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of companies out there that are doing this in their web pages so that Google will find their products, right? And so this is what the schema.org thing is, right? And so a lot of these things are built into just basic tooling. Now, where it starts to become complicated is when you want to add these knowledge graphs, these semantics sorts of things more deeply into what's going on. Then you need to start thinking about using a graph database of some sort, which then lets you organize these relationships, right? But there's a wide variety of commercial ones. There's open source ones. Apache makes a very good one called Fuseki, which is part of Project Jena that we've used extensively. And those then provide, are wrapped in APIs. And so the agents that are coming to this page, they have an API which is documented through Open API or some other web, documentation metadata language that tells an agent what the affordances are essentially. And then, beyond that sort of cyber infrastructure bit, then that's when linking to other vocabularies comes in, right? To provide other information so that it's not just that you're using your information to describe that data set, right? That it's part of it's a data set that's a measurement of some, glacial movement, for example, in terms of some of the examples that I gave, right? But that, you know, it is indicative of a particular process, and that process is calving or some you know, some sort of thing that's in some vocabulary somewhere.
Right. I
So
think a couple of questions in the chat.
In the chat.
okay, yep. Okay. So still considering the information. Yes, this was information rich. But by the way, the recordings and this will be available. It was intentionally information rich, but I hope that it is useful for folks as just a reference to go look at some of the things I've mentioned. A small shop getting started with FAIR principles. I think I would start with schema.org. And I think I would start with these sort of principles of, if you publish a data set, that the data set have, you know, identifiers that are dereferenceable. I would make sure that, you know, the landing pages for those are marked up in, you know, schema.org so that they are discoverable. I would provide APIs to the underlying information, but I would also provide you know, documentation for those APIs through things like, you know, Swagger/Open API, or there's something else called Hydra Core Vocabulary, which is a more semantic way of doing it. And so that way, tool builders can understand what the semantics of your API are, separate from the semantics of the data set and the semantics of the metadata. Okay, so hopefully that that helped. By the way, there's office hours. So if you have more specific questions or you more detailed analysis, there's office hours on Thursday at, oh geez, I don't know what time. It's on Thursday. So
Yeah, 11 a.m.
11 a.m.
Thursday at 11. So
Yep.
Please come ask questions. We can have a more detailed discussion about your use cases and stuff like that. One of the large facilities linking metadata and data, make a move from a directory file based metadata, yeah, to more rich. So I would agree with that. I mean, so part of this is, how do you do incremental you know, innovation with data sets that are in place, and then you know, sort of then start to build out more fair, more linked data sort of things, which are based on the underlying directory systems, right? And there's some techniques that can be used there. So there are mappers, which are used. So this is how the Swiss government is doing it. Essentially, they have, you know, their data sets are in traditional SQL databases. They use a language called RML, which does the semantic mapping, so that the metadata for the data set resources ends up in a commercial, you know, triple store commercial graph database. And they build pipelines, right? And so part of this is building, once again, workflows and pipelines, which we have people in fact plugging the CI/CD pilot that can talk about how you can do that, how we can do that. Yeah, so POSIX-based file systems. Okay, so I guess there was two questions here. Yes, so I started out in POSIX-based file system, you know, in as a chemist and chemistry researcher. I think one of the questions is, how do we start to get from high performance file systems, right, to you know, build the pipelines to start to then move data out for curation and archival, right? And I think that's a second conversation that sort of needs to happen along with the verification process, right? So it's not just capturing the provenance information about the software tools that sort of are writing data, you know, and creating data within a HPC system, and that sort of worldview. But then how do we start to build pipelines that then, as scientists want to do publication and they want to publish the data, it should be in their control as to whether they do it or not. But we behind the scenes should start to create the metadata behind that. And there's projects, there's things like IRODS and some other sorts of file system tools, which have sort of this dual sort of worldview of both a file system and of a metadata system that then is linked to the file system. The other thing to mention is that the Solid project, right, basically has a file system view of the world. Because that's what Tim Berners-Lee originally built the World Wide Web sort of based off of. And so it's less API based and more looks exactly like a sharing resources through a file system, like a traditional sort of web server sort of that. And so I think that there's probably some ways that those things can also be incorporated. And triple stores, yes, some of them are quite expensive. Some of them are not very expensive, and some of them are also free. So as I said, we've been working with Apache Gena's Fuseki, which is not bad. There's a couple of other open source high performance triple stores that are coming online. There's also in the cloud also some innovation. So Neptune, which is now Amazon's triple store, is provided as a service. So you pay for compute time and storage, but it's just like any of their other sort of database engines, right? It's available under the same sort of things, and it basically is running all of Alexa and all of their underlying knowledge infrastructure for their products, right? So they have a vested interest in making these things work, and now they're monetizing them in addition to that. So okay, well, I think we're about out of time, right?
Yep, just about right. I was about to interject. Thank you very much, Chuck. And like he already alluded to, there will be office hours. He's presenting on the topic. He has an hour of time to answer as many questions as you can come up with. Thank you very much, everyone, and great rest of your day. All right.
Bye.